Alistair Croft was one of the richest men in the world, a titan of industry whose name was synonymous with ruthless efficiency and staggering success. He could command markets, bend politicians to his will, and acquire entire corporations with a single phone call. Yet, for all his power, he was utterly helpless. No amount of money, no army of specialists could halt the silent, creeping thief that was stealing his mother. Eleanor Croft, once the vibrant, formidable matriarch of the Croft dynasty, was fading. Confined to her opulent bedroom in the west wing of the sprawling, sterile mansion, she was a ghost in her own life. The diagnosis was as brutal as it was swift, a rare, aggressive neurodegenerative disorder. The world's best doctors had all concurred, offering condolences and palliative care plans. Dr. Julian Finch, her private physician of 10 years, had delivered the final grim prognosis: 3 months. Maybe less. Desperation had made Alistair a tyrant in his own home. He'd cycled through 7 of the most highly credentialed private nurses and caregivers in the country, firing each one for imagined slights or perceived incompetence. None of them could stop the decline. None of them could offer anything but platitudes and pity. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own wealth, reaching for a hand that wasn't there. His grief was a cold, hard shell, and the mansion, once a place of power and prestige, had become a mausoleum waiting for its final occupant. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket, broken only by the hushed footsteps of the skeleton staff who tiptoed through the marble halls, afraid to disturb the king in his mourning. After firing the latest caregiver in a fit of impotent rage, Alistair had instructed his household manager to find a replacement with one simple, impossible demand: find someone who would fix it. It was the desperate plea of a boy, not the command of a billionaire. And so, into this cold, silent world of grief and power walked Clara Bell. She was not a registered nurse with a string of degrees. She was, on paper, just a maid, hired to keep the West Wing tidy and assist as needed. She was a quiet woman in her late 30s, with eyes that held a deep, settled sadness of their own, a sorrow that recognized the shape of the one pervading the Croft mansion. Her past was a carefully guarded vault, but its pain had given her a stillness, an unnerving capacity for observation that made others uncomfortable. She moved through the grand rooms not with the hurried efficiency of the other staff, but with a slow, deliberate grace, as if she were listening to the house itself. Alistair barely registered her arrival, another ghost to add to his collection. He gave her a cursory glance, noted the simple, dark uniform, and dismissed her from his mind. He was too consumed by the countdown, the relentless ticking of the clock Dr. Finch had set. He expected she would last a week, maybe 2, before she, too, failed. But Alistair could not know that Clara's quiet presence was not a sign of meekness, but of profound attention. He could not know that her tragic past had trained her to see the things that everyone else missed, the subtle tremors beneath the surface of a silent tragedy. And he certainly could not fathom that this humble woman, with nothing to her name but a worn-out coat and a heart full of old scars, was about to uncover a truth so monstrous it would not only shatter his world but also give him the one thing his billions could not buy: a chance. The discovery would be small, a detail so insignificant that 6 of the world's best medical minds had overlooked it, but it would lead to a shocking event that would break him and his cold, grieving heart completely. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Clara's first days were a study in silence and routine. Her duties were simple: dust the priceless antiques, change the fine linens, and ensure the sitting area adjacent to Eleanor's bedroom was kept pristine. She was instructed by the household manager, a severe woman named Mrs. Gable, to never speak to Mrs. Croft unless spoken to, an absurd rule given that Eleanor hadn't spoken a coherent word in months. She was to be invisible, a functioning part of the house's machinery, but Clara couldn't be invisible. Her very nature rebelled against it. She was an observer, a collector of details. While she polished the silver-framed photographs on the mantelpiece, she memorized the faces within them. A younger Eleanor, laughing, her arm linked with a handsome man, Alistair's father, gone for 2 decades. A teenage Alistair, already wearing the serious, burdened expression he carried now, standing beside a mother who beamed with pride. She observed the medical ritual that governed the West Wing. Twice a day, like clockwork, Dr. Finch would arrive. He was a handsome, silver-haired man with an impeccable bedside manner and eyes that never seemed to quite match his reassuring smile. He would enter Eleanor's room, closing the door softly behind him. Clara could hear the low murmur of his voice, a soothing, paternal tone. He would emerge 20 minutes later, check something on his tablet, and give a solemn, professional nod to Alistair if he was present. He administered Eleanor's medication personally, a cocktail of pills and a liquid supplement he prepared from a locked case. For her comfort, he had explained to Alistair in Clara's earshot one afternoon, it helps manage the tremors and the agitation. But Clara never saw any tremors. She never saw agitation. She saw only a profound, unnatural stillness. Eleanor lay propped against a mountain of pillows, her skin pale and waxy, her eyes open but unfocused, staring at a point on the ceiling only she could see. She was a doll, beautifully cared for, but lifeless. The other staff kept their distance from the old woman's room. It was a place of death, and they spoke of her in hushed, pitying whispers. They exchanged stories about her former self, the sharp-witted businesswoman who had co-founded the Croft Empire, the formidable hostess, the loving grandmother. They mourned her as if she were already gone. Clara listened, but she watched. She started her own silent ritual. Each morning, before beginning her cleaning, she would stand in the doorway of Eleanor's room for a full minute. She would look at the woman in the bed, not as a patient or a lost cause, but simply as a person. "Good morning, Mrs. Croft," she would whisper, a breach of protocol she knew could get her fired. There was never a response, just the quiet, rhythmic puff of the oxygen machine and the scent of antiseptic and wilting lilies. The inciting incident, the first tiny crack in the monolithic certainty of Eleanor's diagnosis, happened on her 5th day. Clara was replacing the flowers in a vase by the window. They were white roses, Alistair's weekly order, sterile, beautiful, and devoid of scent. As she worked, she hummed a tune without thinking, an old spiritual her own mother used to sing while tending her small garden. It was a simple, mournful melody. As the notes filled the quiet air, Clara, glancing at Eleanor's reflection in the window pane, saw it. A flicker. Eleanor's gaze, usually fixed on the ceiling, shifted. It moved less than an inch, down and to the left, toward the source of the sound. Her eyelids, heavy and still, trembled for a single, breathtaking second. Then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. Her eyes returned to their vacant stare. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She froze, the roses clutched in her hand. Had she imagined it? It was so small, so fleeting. Anyone else would have dismissed it as a trick of the light, an involuntary muscle spasm. But Clara had spent the last 5 years of her own mother's life watching for such signs, learning the silent language of the body when the voice had failed. She knew the difference between a random twitch and a response. This was a response. Later that afternoon, Dr. Finch made his visit. Clara was dusting in the adjoining sitting room, her ears straining. She heard his usual soothing murmurs. When he left, she saw him stop by the nurse's station logbook. He wrote, "Patient remains unresponsive. No change in status." He closed the book with a snap of finality. A lie. Clara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was a lie. The diagnosis was wrong. The story was wrong. Something was terribly, horribly wrong in this house of sorrow, and she, the invisible maid, was the only one who had seen it. That night she didn't sleep. She sat in her small plain room in the staff quarters, the mournful spiritual replaying in her mind, the image of that tiny, impossible flicker burned behind her eyes. A seed of suspicion had been planted in the fertile ground of her grief, and it was already beginning to take root. The seed of suspicion grew into a quiet, determined obsession. Clara understood the precariousness of her position. She was a maid. Her word against that of a renowned physician like Dr. Finch was less than nothing. A direct accusation would see her thrown out onto the street before she finished her sentence. Alistair, walled off by his grief and his faith in the experts he paid so handsomely, would never believe her. So she began a campaign of quiet, methodical reconnaissance, a series of gentle experiments conducted under the guise of her daily chores. Her new purpose gave her movements a focus that bordered on stealth. Her first experiment was a test of scent. The white roses Alistair ordered were chosen for their aesthetic perfection, but they were scentless hybrids. They added to the room's sterile, funereal atmosphere. Clara remembered a conversation she'd overheard between two of the older kitchen staff about how Mrs. Croft used to adore the smell of lavender. Her gardens had once been famous for it. The next morning, on her way to work, Clara spent a few of her precious dollars on a small bundle of fresh lavender from a street vendor. She tucked it into the pocket of her apron. Inside the west wing, she waited until she was alone. With her heart pounding, she approached Eleanor's bedside. She held the lavender a few inches from the old woman's face. "Mrs. Croft," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, "I brought you something. I heard you liked lavender." For a long moment there was nothing, just the steady beep of the monitor, the hiss of oxygen. Clara felt a pang of disappointment. Then she saw it. A subtle flaring of Eleanor's nostrils, a single sharp intake of breath that was deeper than the shallow respirations she'd maintained for days. Her eyelids fluttered again, that same tremor Clara had seen before. It was confirmation, a second data point. Next, she focused on touch. The nurses and Dr. Finch handled Eleanor with a detached clinical efficiency. They turned her to prevent bed sores, checked her vitals, and adjusted her pillows, but their touch was impersonal. It was the touch one gives to an object, not a person. Clara's own experience had taught her the power of simple human contact. One afternoon, while straightening the duvet, she let her hand rest for a moment on Eleanor's. The old woman's skin was cool and papery. Clara began to gently stroke the back of her hand with her thumb, a soothing circular motion. She spoke softly, not about the weather or empty pleasantries, but about her own day. "The sun is lovely this afternoon, Mrs. Croft. It's making the dust motes dance in the hallway. It reminds me of my mother's house." She felt a faint, almost imperceptible pressure against her palm. Eleanor's fingers, limp and curled, had tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. It was so slight, Clara almost doubted her senses. She stopped the stroking motion. The pressure vanished. She started again. The pressure returned. Her most audacious experiment involved sound. Building on her initial discovery, she couldn't risk humming again. It had been an accident, and a repeated performance might draw attention. She needed something else. During her cleaning of Alistair's private study, a room she was only allowed in once a week, she noticed an old, leather-bound photo album left open on a side table. Inside were pictures of a family holiday in Italy, years ago. In one photo, a younger, happier Alistair was playing a guitar while Eleanor and his father sang, their heads thrown back in laughter. The caption, in Eleanor's elegant script, read, "Our nightly serenade, O sole mio." The next day, Clara brought her phone to work, a cheap, outdated model. In the privacy of a supply closet, she found a recording of the famous Neapolitan song sung by a classic tenor. She waited for her moment when the house was at its quietest, between the morning shift change and Dr. Finch's impending arrival. She slipped into Eleanor's room, closed the door almost all the way, and played the music at the lowest possible volume. The rich, passionate voice of the tenor filled the space. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and stunning. A single perfect tear welled in the corner of her right eye, broke free, and traced a glistening path down her temple into her silver hair. Her breathing hitched, a soft, choked sound, a shadow of a sob. Her lips parted, and a soft, airy sound escaped, too faint to be a word, but it was a vocalization. It was a sound of pure, unfiltered emotion. Clara quickly shut off the music, her own eyes filling with tears. This was it. This was undeniable. This wasn't a twitch or a reflex. This was memory. This was sorrow. This was a person, trapped inside a silent prison, responding to a key that had been long forgotten. She began to keep a small secret journal, a cheap notebook she hid in the lining of her purse. In it, she documented every detail: the date, the time, the stimulus, and the response. Lavender, flared nostrils, deepened breath. Touch, faint pressure from fingers. O sole mio. A tear, a choked sob, a vocalization. It was a collection of evidence, a testament against the official narrative of a vacancy and decline. Her suspicion of Dr. Finch hardened into a cold certainty. He wasn't just misdiagnosing Eleanor, he was actively ignoring or suppressing these signs. The man who was supposed to be providing comfort was, in fact, reinforcing the walls of her prison. And Clara, armed with lavender, a gentle touch, and an old Italian song, was beginning to find the cracks. Her internal world was a storm of conflicting emotions: fear of being discovered, fierce protectiveness of the vulnerable woman in the bed, and a growing, dangerous hope that felt like a fire in her chest. The small secret victories fueled Clara's resolve, but she knew they were not enough. A finger twitch and a single tear were ghosts of proof, easily dismissed. She needed something more concrete, a breakthrough so undeniable that even a man as walled off as Alistair Croft would be forced to see it. She felt a desperate sense of urgency. Dr. Finch's 3 months prognosis was not just a timeline, it felt like a threat. The days were slipping away, and with them, Eleanor's chances. Clara decided to combine her methods to create a perfect storm of sensory triggers. She thought back to the photograph of the laughing family in Italy. The song had worked. What else was in that picture? Sunshine, joy, family. She couldn't replicate those, but she could try to evoke the feeling. Her opportunity came on a rare, brilliantly sunny Thursday. Mrs. Gable, the household manager, was out for the day at a dental appointment, and the temporary replacement was far less observant. Dr. Finch had already made his morning visit, leaving the long afternoon open. Alistair was, as usual, sequestered in his downtown office tower, a remote god directing his empire. The West Wing was quiet. Clara began by breaking a major rule. The heavy damask curtains in Eleanor's room were always kept drawn, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight that Alistair claimed was less agitating for his mother. Clara walked to the grand window and, with a smooth, decisive pull, drew the curtains wide open. A brilliant shaft of late-afternoon sunlight sliced through the gloom, illuminating the room in a warm, golden glow. Dust motes, just as she'd described to Eleanor days before, danced in the beam of light. She then took out the small bundle of lavender she now carried with her daily and placed it in a small vase of water on the bedside table, its gentle scent beginning to permeate the air. She moved to the bed. "Mrs. Croft," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Eleanor, it's such a beautiful day, too beautiful to be kept in the dark." She took the old woman's frail hand in both of hers, chafing it gently to bring some warmth to the cool skin. She began to hum the simple melody of O Sole Mio, not playing the recording this time, but using her own untrained voice. It was a clumsy, humble performance, a world away from the professional tenor, but it was earnest. She poured all of her hope, all of her desperate conviction, into the simple tune. For a full minute, nothing happened. Eleanor lay as still as stone, a marble effigy in a sunlit tomb. Clara's heart sank. Had she pushed too far? Had she misread everything? She continued to hum, her voice faltering slightly, stroking Eleanor's hand. And then it began. It started with the fingers. They didn't just apply pressure. They curled, weakly but deliberately, around her own. A squeeze. Then Eleanor's head, which had been lolling slightly to one side, began to turn. It was an agonizingly slow, creaking movement, the motion of muscles long unused. She turned her head on the pillow away from the familiar ceiling and toward the window, toward the light. Her eyes, which had been so vacant, blinked. Once, twice. They seemed to be focusing, struggling to make sense of the sudden brightness. The tear came next, the same as before, but this time it was followed by another and another, until silent tears streamed from both eyes, catching the sunlight like tiny prisms. Clara stopped humming, her breath caught in her throat. She watched, mesmerized and terrified. Eleanor's gaze drifted from the window, across the room, and finally, impossibly, it landed on Clara's face. For the first time, Clara felt truly seen. The vacant stare was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, heart-wrenching recognition and confusion. Her lips, dry and pale, trembled, and then parted. A sound emerged, a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of a voice that had not been used for its true purpose in a very long time. It was one word, spoken with an almost superhuman effort, yet it was as clear as a bell in the silent room. Anna. The name hung in the air, a fragile, perfect thing. Clara's blood ran cold. Anna was her mother's name. In her soft, one-sided conversations with Eleanor, she had spoken of her mother often, sharing memories of her kindness, her garden, her songs. Eleanor had been listening, she had remembered. She wasn't just responding to stimuli, she was connecting, communicating. She had forged a link between the comforting presence at her bedside and the stories she was told. Clara knelt by the bed, her own tears now flowing freely, mingling with Eleanor's on the fine linen sheets. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Eleanor, it's me, Clara." Eleanor's eyes held hers for another moment, a universe of unspoken words passing between them, before the immense effort overwhelmed her. Her eyelids fluttered and closed. Her hand went limp. Her breathing returned to its shallow, even rhythm. She had slipped back beneath the surface, but she had come up for air. She had spoken a name. It was the breakthrough. It was the proof. It was the miracle and the bombshell all in one, and Clara knew with chilling certainty that everything was about to change. The aftershock of Eleanor's utterance left Clara trembling. Anna. The name was a key, a weapon, a prayer. She had to tell Alistair. She couldn't wait. The fear of being fired was eclipsed by a greater fear, the fear of what would happen if she stayed silent. She tidied the room with shaking hands, her mind racing. She closed the curtains again, erasing the evidence of her transgression, but the sunlight seemed to have burned its image into the very air. She had to choose her moment carefully. A hysterical phone call would be dismissed. An ambush in the hallway would be rebuffed. She needed to confront him when he was a captive audience, but on her terms. Later that evening, Alistair returned to the mansion, his face etched with the weariness of a man carrying the world on his shoulders. He went through his nightly ritual, a stiff drink in his study, a cursory check of his emails, and then the solemn walk to the West Wing to sit by his mother's bedside for 10 minutes of silent, agonizing vigil. Clara waited. She knew he would be there. She gathered her courage, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and walked toward the lion's den. She found him sitting in a plush armchair beside Eleanor's bed, staring at his mother's still form, his handsome face a mask of cold despair. The only light came from a single, low-wattage lamp, casting long shadows that made the opulent room feel like a crypt. He didn't look up as she entered. "What is it?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of interest. He assumed she was there to turn down the bed or some other menial task. "Mr. Croft," Clara began, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need to speak with you about your mother." This got his attention. He finally turned his head, his gray eyes narrowing with irritation. "If this is about needing more supplies, speak to Mrs. Gable. I am not to be disturbed." "No, sir. It's not about supplies." She took a step closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Your mother spoke today." Alistair's expression shifted from irritation to a cold, dangerous fury. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to suck the very air from the room. "Get out," he said, his voice a low growl. "I will not have you come in here with your sentimental fantasies. I have fired people for less. Do not insult my intelligence or my mother's memory with this nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Clara insisted, her own voice rising with a passion she couldn't suppress. She said a name. "I was here this afternoon. I opened the curtains, I hummed a song, and she looked at me. She really looked at me, and she said a name." "A name?" Alistair scoffed, a bitter, humorless sound. "She makes noises, guttural sounds. Dr. Finch has explained it's a symptom of the disease's progression, random nerve firings." "This was not a random noise," Clara shot back, taking another step forward, violating every rule of their employer-employee relationship. "It was a word. It was clear. She said, 'Anna.'" Alistair froze. The name clearly meant something to him. His stony facade cracked for a fraction of a second, revealing a flicker of raw pain before it was sealed over again. "Anna was my grandmother's name," he said, his voice tight. "She's been dead for 30 years. It's a coincidence, a trick of your mind. Now get out before I call security." "It wasn't a coincidence." Clara's desperation made her bold. "I've been talking to her about my own mother, whose name was Anna. She heard me. She remembered. Mr. Croft, she is in there. She is trapped, and you are all letting it happen." That was the final straw. Alistair's face contorted with rage and grief. "You are fired," he snarled. "Pack your things. I want you out of this house in 1 hour." He turned his back on her, a gesture of absolute dismissal. Tears of frustration and fury pricked Clara's eyes. She had failed. It was over. But as she turned to leave, a surge of defiant courage washed over her. She would not leave without one last try. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking. "Fire me, but before I go, let me show you." Alistair didn't turn around. "There is nothing to show." "Then what are you afraid of?" Clara challenged. The question hung in the air. It was a direct strike at his pride, his control. Slowly, glacially, he turned back to face her. His eyes were chips of ice. "What do you propose, you foolish woman?" he whispered. "The song," Clara said, her mind racing. She reacted to the song, "O Sole Mio." Alistair's expression was one of utter contempt, but he didn't stop her. He was indulging her. One final cruel act before casting her out. He would prove her a fool, and then be done with it. With trembling fingers, Clara took out her phone. She found the recording. Alistair watched her, his arms crossed, a statue of disbelief. "Watch her," Clara pleaded. "Don't watch me. Watch her face." She pressed play. The tenor's voice, rich and full of longing, filled the silent room once more. For 10 seconds, nothing. Alistair's lips curled into a triumphant, bitter smirk. He was about to speak, to deliver the final blow, and then it happened. Just as before, a single tear welled in the corner of Eleanor's eye. It traced its slow path down her temple. Her chest hitched with that same silent sob, but this time there was more. Her eyes, which had been closed, fluttered open. They were unfocused at first, but then they moved, searching. They passed over Clara, and then they found him, her son. Eleanor's gaze locked onto Alistair's face, and from her lips a new sound, a rasp, an effort, a ghost of a word. Ollie. It was his childhood name, the name only she had ever used. Alistair Croft, the billionaire titan, the master of the universe, broke. The sound that escaped his throat was not a word but a raw animal noise of pure shock and pain. His mask of cold control didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 pieces. He stumbled forward, falling to his knees by his mother's bedside, his face a ruin of disbelief and dawning, terrifying hope. He stared at her, then at Clara, then back at his mother. The music played on, a soundtrack to the complete demolition of his world. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, he didn't see a maid or an employee. He saw the only person in the world who had not given up. His fury was gone, replaced by a bewildering maelstrom of confusion, fear, and a fragile gratitude that was so foreign it felt like a wound. "What is happening?" he whispered, his voice ragged. The alliance was formed in that moment, not with a handshake or a contract, but in a shared look over the bed of the woman they both refused to lose, bound by a single, impossible whisper, Ollie. The fragile, unspoken alliance between the billionaire and the maid transformed the West Wing into a clandestine theater of operations. Outwardly, nothing changed. Clara continued her duties, and Alistair maintained his cold, distant demeanor in front of the staff and, most importantly, Dr. Finch. But beneath the surface, a silent, urgent investigation was underway. Alistair, a man accustomed to wielding power through data and force, was now navigating the unfamiliar territory of intuition and subtlety, guided by Clara. His first instinct was to confront Dr. Finch immediately, to bring the full weight of his legal team down upon him. But Clara, with a wisdom born of her own painful past, urged caution. "We have a tear and a whisper, Mr. Croft," she had said to him in a hushed meeting in his study late one night. "He will call it an anomaly. He will say we are projecting our hopes onto her. He will increase her medication to calm her, and we will lose her again, maybe for good. We need proof, something he can't explain away." Alistair, humbled, and for the first time in his adult life, uncertain, agreed. His world had been turned upside down. The medical certainties he had paid millions for were now suspect, and the only person he trusted was the woman he had been about to fire. He began by using his resources. He hired a private investigation firm, one of the most discreet in the world, to do a deep dive into Dr. Julian Finch's life. He wanted to know everything: his financial history, his professional record, his personal life. He expected to find a hidden scandal, a malpractice suit, something to explain the deception. Meanwhile, Clara's role shifted. She was no longer just an observer. She was an active investigator, using her access and her intuition as her primary tools. At Alistair's instruction, she began searching for anything that could shed light on Eleanor's condition before her rapid decline. "My mother was meticulous," Alistair told her. "She kept records of everything. There are boxes of her old papers in the attic storage. See what you can find." The attic was a dusty archive of a life well lived. Trunks filled with old letters, photo albums, and financial ledgers from the early days of the company. Clara spent hours there, under the guise of seasonal cleaning, poring over the artifacts of Eleanor Croft's past. She found photo albums filled with images of a vibrant, powerful woman. Eleanor on safari, Eleanor christening a shipping tanker, Eleanor laughing with her grandchildren. The contrast with the silent figure in the bed was a physical blow. Then, tucked away in a small leather-bound trunk, she found it. It wasn't a dramatic smoking gun, but a small, crucial discrepancy. It was a stack of Eleanor's personal journals, dating back years. Clara focused on the year leading up to the diagnosis. For months, the entries were typical. Notes about board meetings, frustrations with a rose blight in her garden, plans for a family holiday. Then the tone began to shift. An entry from about 18 months prior read, "Feeling a bit foggy lately, Julian says it's just stress, prescribed a mild relaxant. I do hate taking pills. A few weeks later, the fog is worse, had trouble remembering Henderson's name in the meeting today. Utterly mortifying. Julian is concerned. He wants to run some tests. The crucial entry came a month after that. Tests came back clear, thank heavens. Just exhaustion, Julian says. He suggested a new proprietary vitamin supplement from a clinic in Switzerland. He says it's all the rage in Europe for maintaining cognitive vitality. Very expensive, but what's money for? He'll be administering it himself to ensure the dosage is correct. Clara's blood ran cold. The vitamin supplement. The one Dr. Finch still administered personally from his locked case. She frantically flipped through the subsequent pages. The entries grew shorter, the handwriting more erratic. Supplement makes me so sleepy. Hard to focus. Allie is worried. Julian says it's my body adjusting. The final entry, written in a shaky, almost illegible scrawl, was from just over a year ago. Can't think. Room is spinning. Julian helps. After that, the pages were blank. The journal ended. The woman who wrote it had vanished, replaced by the silent patient in the bed. Clara carefully photographed the pages with her phone. That night she met with Alistair again. The initial report from his investigators had come back, and it was frustratingly clean. Dr. Finch had an impeccable public record. No malpractice suits, no board sanctions. He lived well, but within the means of a top private physician. There was, however, one small flag, a series of wire transfers to a bank in the Cayman Islands disguised as investments in a medical research fund. It was suspicious, but not conclusive. But when Clara showed him the photos of the journal entries, everything clicked into place. The timeline was perfect. The slow, creeping fog, the clear test results, and then the dramatic decline immediately following the introduction of the mysterious vitamin supplement. "He's been poisoning her," Alistair said, the words falling like stones in the silent study, "for over a year, slowly, methodically." The realization was horrifying, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't a tragedy, it was a crime. The grief that had paralyzed him for months began to transform, hardening into a cold, diamond-sharp rage. He finally had a target for his anger, but the question remained, why? Why would a successful doctor do this? The answer, they both knew, was still hidden. But they had their artifact. They had the journal, the testimony of the victim herself, written before her voice was stolen. The investigation had just entered a dangerous new phase. The journal entries became the cornerstone of their case, the Rosetta Stone that translated Eleanor's silent suffering into a narrative of deliberate harm. The central question now loomed over them, vast and terrifying. Why? What could possibly motivate a man like Dr. Finch to slowly poison a woman who trusted him, his patient, of over a decade? Alistair, now operating with the cold fury of a predator, put his full resources into answering that question. He tasked his investigators with a single, obsessive focus: follow the money from Finch's Cayman Islands account and find the motive. While the digital breadcrumbs were being traced across the globe, Clara had an idea. "The will," she said to Alistair during one of their clandestine late-night meetings. "People do terrible things for inheritances." Alistair initially dismissed it. "My mother's will is straightforward. The bulk of the estate goes to me, with significant trusts for my children. Finch isn't in it. I've seen it." "Are you sure?" Clara pressed gently. "Is it possible there's a codicil, a separate document? Your mother was a complex woman. She had her own philanthropic projects, separate from the Maincroft Foundation." The suggestion sparked something in Alistair's memory. He made a call to his family's oldest and most trusted lawyer, a man who had served his father. The next day, the lawyer arrived at the mansion with a locked briefcase. In the privacy of the study, he revealed the existence of what he called the Eleanor Croft Discretionary Fund. It was a charitable trust Eleanor had set up years ago, dedicated to funding arts and music programs for underprivileged children, a cause dear to her heart. It was to be funded with a significant one-time endowment of $50 million from her personal assets, an endowment that would only be transferred upon her death. The lawyer then turned to the final page, detailing the governance of the trust. Alistair's blood turned to ice as he read the name of the sole executor, the individual given complete control over how and when the funds were dispersed, Dr. Julian Finch. The motive was suddenly blindingly clear: $50 million. As sole executor, Finch would have the power to direct those funds, to award grants to organizations of his choosing, to pay himself a hefty administrative fee. It was a perfect vehicle for money laundering, for paying off debts, for skimming vast sums of cash with minimal oversight. The investigators' report arrived that same evening, and it was the final nail in the coffin. The Cayman Islands account was a front. The real money trail led to a series of high-stakes, unregulated online gambling syndicates based in Eastern Europe. Dr. Finch wasn't just a gambler. He was a degenerate, with debts estimated to be in the tens of millions. He wasn't just trying to get rich. He was trying to save his own skin from creditors who were far less forgiving than any bank. He was desperate, and Eleanor's life was the price of his salvation. The most chilling piece of the puzzle came from the lab Alistair had secretly commissioned. Under the guise of a routine environmental check, a technician had managed to acquire a sample from the bottle of vitamin supplement in Dr. Finch's medical bag. The results of the gas chromatography and mass spectrometry were unequivocal. The liquid was not a vitamin. It was a complex, custom-compounded cocktail. Its primary ingredients were a powerful, long-acting benzodiazepine combined with a beta-blocker. Separately, they were common medications. Together and administered in steady, increasing doses over a long period, they would produce symptoms that perfectly mimicked a rapid-onset neurodegenerative disease, cognitive fog, memory loss, lethargy, muscle weakness, and a flattened emotional affect. It was a slow-acting, bespoke poison designed not to kill quickly, but to medically erase a person while they were still alive. It was a chemical straitjacket. Alistair stared at the lab report, the pages trembling in his hand. The systematic, cold-blooded cruelty of it was almost beyond comprehension. Finch hadn't just hoped Eleanor would die. He had actively, scientifically engineered her decline. He had paraded the world's best specialists through her room, knowing full well they would see the symptoms he was creating and confirm his fabricated diagnosis. He had stood by Alistair's side, offering condolences and sympathy for a tragedy he himself was authoring minute by minute, dose by dose. The 3 months left prognosis wasn't a medical opinion. It was a statement of intent. It was the timeline he had set for himself to receive his $50 million payout. The full, monstrous truth was now laid bare. Dr. Finch was not a healer. He was a murderer in slow motion. And Clara, the quiet maid, had seen the truth in a flicker of an eyelid, a twitch of a finger. The rage in Alistair's chest was a white-hot furnace. The time for quiet investigation was over. The time for retribution had begun. Dr. Finch was a man of supreme confidence, a confidence built on a lifetime of cultivated authority and the successful execution of his monstrous plan. He was, however, not a fool. In the days following Alistair's shattering breakthrough at Eleanor's bedside, Finch began to sense a subtle shift in the mansion's atmosphere. The air, once thick with stagnant grief, now seemed to crackle with a new, hidden energy. He noticed the change in Alistair first. The billionaire's despair had been replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity that Finch found unnerving. Their conversations became shorter, Alistair's questions more pointed, less about Eleanor's comfort, and more about the specific chemical composition of her medications. Then Finch noticed that the new maid, Clara, was no longer quite so invisible. He would catch her watching him with an unnerving stillness, her gaze holding none of the deference or fear he was used to from the staff. He saw her speaking in low, confidential tones with Alistair in the garden. He was a man with a guilty secret, and his senses were finely tuned to the scent of discovery. His paranoia kicked into high gear when he attempted to administer Eleanor's afternoon supplement and found himself blocked. A new, stern-faced nurse, one he didn't recognize, informed him that Mr. Croft had issued new orders. All medications were now to be logged and administered by the in-house nursing staff only. When Finch protested, citing his long-standing role as primary physician, he was politely but firmly shown the new signed protocol. He was being frozen out. He realized with a jolt of pure panic that they knew, or at the very least, they suspected. His carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. He had to act to seize back control of the narrative and discredit the source of the threat. He knew instinctively that the source was Clara. She was the anomaly, the new variable that had changed the equation. He had to neutralize her. Finch couldn't attack Alistair directly. The man was a fortress of power and wealth. But Clara was vulnerable. She was a maid with a past he could invent, a nobody he could easily frame. He began his retaliation with a campaign of insidious psychological warfare. He found Alistair in his study, his face a mask of grave concern. "Alistair," he began, using his most paternal tone, "I am deeply worried about you and about your mother's care." He proceeded to tell a story he had carefully concocted. He claimed he had run a background check on Clara Bell, a standard precaution for staff with such close access to a vulnerable patient. "The results are disturbing," Finch said, pulling a fabricated file from his briefcase. He'd had a forger create a fake police report and a letter from a fictional previous employer. The documents painted Clara as a professional grifter, a bereavement predator who specialized in infiltrating grieving families, creating false hope to gain their trust, and then exploiting them financially. "She has a history of this, Alistair," Finch said, his voice laced with feigned sorrow. "She convinces families their loved ones are improving, alienates them from their doctors, and then, once she's embedded, she finds a way to get into their finances. The breakthroughs you're seeing with your mother? I'm afraid they are likely a cruel manipulation. She's telling you what you want to hear." The poison in his words was as potent as the one in his medical bag. He was preying on Alistair's deepest fears and his desperate desire to believe in a miracle. To cement his lie, Finch took it a step further. Knowing the mansion was under surveillance, he waited for an opportunity. One night, when Clara was off duty, he used a master key he'd had copied years ago to enter her small room. He planted a handful of Eleanor's smaller, less noticeable pieces of jewelry, a pair of pearl earrings, a silver locket, in the back of her closet, tucked inside an old shoe. The next day he went to Alistair again. "One of the nurses noticed your mother's locket was missing. I suggested a discreet search of the staff quarters. I'm so sorry to have to show you this." He presented Alistair with photos of the jewelry discovered in Clara's room. The trap was set. Alistair was caught in an agonizing position. His heart, his intuition, screamed that Clara was innocent, that she was the one telling the truth. But Finch's evidence, though fabricated, was tangible. The fake reports, the planted jewelry, it was a carefully constructed narrative designed to prey on the caution of a man like him. The potential damage was enormous. If Finch went to the press with this story, the scandal would be catastrophic, not just for Alistair personally, but for his global corporation. For the first time, a sliver of doubt entered Alistair's mind. What if he was the one being played? Torn and desperate to protect his mother above all else, Alistair made a devastating choice. He confronted Clara not with rage, but with a cold, heartbreaking formality. He showed her the file, the photos. "I don't believe this," he said, his voice hollow, "but I cannot risk it. I can't risk my mother's safety or a public scandal while she is so vulnerable. I have to place you on temporary leave with pay. You'll be housed in a hotel. You are not to contact me or come near this house until I have sorted this out." Clara was devastated. She looked at him, her eyes pleading, and saw not the ally she had forged, but the cold, cautious billionaire again. The separation was a physical blow. She was being cast out, isolated from the very person she was trying to save. For Dr. Finch, it was a victory. He had successfully cut the head off the snake. With Clara gone, he could reassert his control. And to prove his point, to show Alistair the folly of his hope, he immediately and secretly increased the dosage of the poison he administered to Eleanor. The effect was immediate and brutal. Within 48 hours, Eleanor regressed completely. The light in her eyes vanished. The responsiveness, the whispers, the tears, all gone. She was once again the still, silent doll in the bed. Finch pointed to this tragic decline as the ultimate proof. "You see, Alistair," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "the moment the stimulus, the manipulator, is removed, the patient returns to her baseline. It was all a cruel illusion." The crisis was complete. Clara was exiled, Eleanor was fading faster than ever, and Dr. Finch was, once again, in control. The 2 days following Clara's dismissal were the darkest of Alistair's life. He watched his mother slide back into the silent, vacant abyss, and the sight extinguished the fragile hope that had just begun to bloom in his heart. Dr. Finch's words echoed in his mind, a venomous whisper of doubt. Had it all been an illusion? Had his desperation made him a willing fool? He sat by Eleanor's bedside, searching her still face for any sign, any flicker of the woman who had whispered his name, but there was nothing. The emptiness was absolute. It was in this pit of despair that his grief finally burned away, leaving behind something cold, hard and clear, rage. He looked at his mother, then thought of Clara, alone in a hotel room, and the two images refused to reconcile with Finch's neat, tidy story. The doubt he'd felt about Clara was eclipsed by a tidal wave of revulsion for the doctor's smug, sympathetic face. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he had made a terrible mistake. He had trusted the snake over the Savior. That evening, Alistair Croft, the grieving son, died, and Alistair Croft, the corporate predator, was reborn, but with a new, singular purpose. He would not just expose Finch, he would utterly destroy him. He began by moving his mother. He called the head of the city's most exclusive private hospital, a man who owed him a significant favor. Within hours, under the guise of a sudden complication requiring specialized observation, Eleanor was moved by private ambulance to a secure VIP suite on the top floor. The suite became a fortress. Alistair hired his own private security team, ex-military, to guard the door. The new protocol was absolute. No one saw Eleanor without Alistair's direct personal authorization. Dr. Finch's access was officially and completely severed. When Finch arrived at the mansion for his evening visit and found Eleanor gone, he panicked. He called Alistair, his voice a frantic mix of outrage and fear. Alistair answered, his own voice chillingly calm. "Her condition has changed, Doctor. Your services are no longer required. A check for your severance will be messengered to you. Do not contact me or my family again." He hung up, leaving Finch in a state of pure terror. Alistair's next call was to Clara. "I'm sending a car for you," he said, his voice raw with an apology he couldn't yet put into words. "I was a fool. I need you." When Clara arrived at the hospital, Alistair met her not as an employer, but as a penitent co-conspirator. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "I let him get inside my head. I chose to protect my reputation over my mother. It will not happen again." He led her into the hospital suite. Seeing Eleanor so diminished, so vacant again, was a knife to Clara's heart. But there was no time for sorrow. They had work to do. "He framed you," Alistair stated, laying out the details of the planted jewelry and the forged documents. "My security team is pulling the mansion's surveillance footage now. We'll find proof of him entering your room." With Eleanor now safe and beyond Finch's reach, they focused on gathering the final pieces of their arsenal. Clara, remembering the details from Eleanor's journal, had an idea. "The clinic in Switzerland," she said, "the one that supposedly made the vitamin supplement, does it exist?" Alistair's investigators got on it immediately. The clinic did exist, but it was a high-end wellness spa, not a pharmaceutical research lab. They had no affiliation with Dr. Finch and had never heard of the proprietary supplement he described. It was another dead end, another lie. The final crucial piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. One of the nurses who had been on Eleanor's staff at the mansion, a young woman who had been dismissed by Finch months earlier for being too inquisitive, heard through the grapevine that the doctor had been fired. Emboldened, she contacted Alistair's office. She told a story of how she had once questioned the cloudy, viscous nature of the supplement Finch administered. Finch had berated her, accusing her of questioning his authority, and had her fired the next day. She had always been suspicious, but was too terrified of the powerful doctor to speak up. Now she was willing to sign a sworn affidavit. They had it all. The lab results of the poison, the financial records detailing Finch's motive, the sworn testimony from the nurse, Eleanor's own journal, and soon they would have the security footage of Finch planting the jewelry, the final proof of his malicious campaign to discredit Clara. Alistair scheduled the confrontation. He instructed his lawyers to arrange a meeting with Dr. Finch at his corporate headquarters downtown, under the pretense of discussing the terms of his severance package. Finch, desperate, and likely assuming he could still negotiate or threaten his way into a handsome settlement, agreed to attend. Alistair sat in his vast, top-floor office, the city lights twinkling below like a conquered kingdom. Clara sat beside him, no longer a maid in a uniform, but an equal partner in the coming war. The trap was set. The rage in Alistair's heart had been forged into a weapon, and he was ready to use it. The time for hiding was over. The confrontation was at hand. Dr. Julian Finch walked into Alistair Croft's office with the practiced swagger of a man who believed he still held a few trump cards. He saw the severance meeting as a negotiation, a chance to leverage the threat of a public scandal into a golden parachute that would solve all his problems. The office was intimidating, a cavern of glass and steel overlooking the city, designed to make visitors feel small. He saw Alistair sitting behind a vast mahogany desk, and, to his surprise, the maid, Clara, sitting not in a subservient position, but in a chair beside him, an equal. Two of Alistair's lawyers stood grimly by the window. "Alistair," Finch began, his tone smooth and conciliatory, "I'm glad we could meet to discuss this unfortunate misunderstanding in a civilized manner." Alistair didn't rise. He simply stared at Finch, his gray eyes as cold and hard as granite. "There is no misunderstanding, Julian," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "There is only the truth, and your time for telling lies is over." Finch's smile faltered. "I'm not sure I understand. I have provided your mother with nothing but the most devoted care for 10 years. "Let's talk about that care," Alistair said, leaning forward. He gestured to one of his lawyers, who placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. "This is a lab report for the proprietary vitamin supplement you've been administering to my mother for the last 18 months. Finch's face went pale. "That's privileged medical information." "It's evidence," Alistair countered, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Evidence of a custom compounded cocktail of benzodiazepines and beta-blockers. A poison designed to mimic the symptoms of a neurodegenerative disease." Finch began to bluster, his composure cracking. "This is outrageous. It's a therapeutic compound designed to manage her symptoms." "What symptoms, Julian?" Clara spoke for the first time, her voice clear and strong, cutting through his defense. "The fog she started feeling only after you gave her the first dose? The confusion you told her was just exhaustion, even after her tests came back clear?" She held up her phone, displaying the photo of Eleanor's journal entry. Finch stared at the image of his patient's handwriting, a ghost from the past, and for the first time, raw fear flashed in his eyes. The lawyer placed a second file on the desk. "These are your financial records," Alistair continued, his voice relentless. "The wire transfers to the Caymans, the gambling debts amounting to over $20 million, the creditors who are, I imagine, becoming quite impatient." A third file landed on the pile. "And this," Alistair said, "is a copy of my mother's discretionary trust, the $50 million fund for the arts, the fund of which you are the sole executor upon her death." Finch was unraveling. Sweat beaded on his forehead. "This is a violation of my privacy. It's slander. You have no proof of anything." "Oh, but we do," Alistair said. He nodded to the large screen on the wall, which flickered to life. It showed security footage from the Croft mansion, time stamped from 3 nights prior. The footage was from a hidden camera in the hallway outside Clara's room. It showed Dr. Finch looking furtively down the hall before using a key to slip inside her room. A few minutes later he emerged, empty-handed. "And then there's the matter of the jewelry you found," Alistair said coldly. "A clumsy attempt to frame the one person who was smart enough to see through you." Finch stared at the screen, his mouth agape. He was trapped, exposed, his web of lies torn to shreds. He sank into a chair, his handsome face collapsing into a mask of pathetic defeat. I was desperate," he stammered. "The debts, they were going to kill me." "So you decided to kill my mother instead," Alistair finished for him, his voice laced with venom, slowly, "so you could play the part of the grieving doctor while waiting to cash in." At that moment the office doors opened. 2 uniformed police detectives stepped inside. "Dr. Julian Finch," one of them said, his voice official and final. "You are under arrest for attempted murder, criminal negligence, and fraud." As the detectives cuffed him, Finch looked from Alistair's merciless face to Clara's steady gaze. In her eyes he saw no triumph, only a quiet, profound sorrow for the man he was and the trust he had so monstrously betrayed. His reign of terror was over. The climax of the drama, however, did not take place in that sterile office. It happened 2 hours later in the quiet, sunlit room of the hospital. The news had cleared the air, a thunderstorm that had finally broken. Clara walked into Eleanor's suite alone. The old woman was lying in bed just as she had been, the sedatives still lingering in her system. But now she was safe. Clara sat beside her, took her hand, and simply waited. She didn't hum or talk. She just sat, her presence a silent promise. After about 20 minutes, Eleanor's eyelids fluttered. She turned her head, her movement still weak, and her eyes found Clara's. The vacant haze was gone. There was a glimmer of light, of recognition. A small, weak smile touched her lips. "Clara," she whispered. The name was faint, but it was clear. It was a confirmation, a homecoming. Alistair stood in the doorway watching, his heart overflowing with a gratitude so immense it felt like pain. He saw Clara lean forward and gently squeeze his mother's hand. The poison was gone, the liar was in chains, and the long, slow journey back to the light had just begun. Clara's name was cleared, her quiet courage vindicated, and in the space of a single whispered word from a woman brought back from the brink, a new family was being forged in the crucible of truth. A year later, the Croft mansion was unrecognizable. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the sounds of life. Laughter echoed in the marble halls. The scent of fresh-baked bread often drifted from the kitchen, and the gardens, once sterile and manicured, now exploded with the chaotic color of lavender, roses, and wildflowers. The West Wing, once a somber sick ward, was now Eleanor's vibrant apartment, filled with music, books, and the frequent visits of her grandchildren. Eleanor Croft, the woman given 3 months to live, sat in a comfortable wheelchair on the sun-drenched terrace, a cashmere blanket over her knees. Her physical recovery was a slow, arduous process. The poison had taken a heavy toll on her muscles and nerves, but her mind, her spirit was as sharp and radiant as ever. She was directing a gardener, her voice firm but kind, pointing out where she wanted the new delphiniums planted. Beside her, helping her sort through seed packets, was Clara. Clara was no longer the invisible maid. She wore a simple linen dress, her face relaxed and happy. Her official title was now Eleanor's chief companion, but her true role was far deeper. She was the heart of the home, the quiet center around which the new healed family revolved. She and Eleanor shared a bond that transcended words, a deep, knowing friendship forged in the darkest of hours. The transformation in Alistair was perhaps the most profound. The cold, ruthless billionaire was gone, replaced by a man who had learned the value of presence. He had delegated more of the day-to-day operations of his empire, rediscovering his role as a son and a father. He now worked from his home study more often than not, and his greatest pleasure was the simple act of having lunch on the terrace with his mother and Clara. His relationship with Clara had blossomed slowly, naturally, out of the soil of shared crisis and immense gratitude. The professional lines had blurred, replaced by a deep, abiding respect that had over the months deepened into love. It was a quiet love, built not on grand romantic gestures, but on shared glances, easy silences, and the mutual understanding of having walked through fire together. He was no longer just her employer, he was her partner. The family's new chapter was publicly cemented at a gala event for the newly restructured Eleanor Croft Foundation for Patient Advocacy. The $50 million, once a lure for a murderer, had been reclaimed and repurposed. The foundation's new mission was to provide legal and investigative support for families who suspected medical malpractice or elder abuse. The grand ballroom was filled with the city's elite, but the center of attention was the small group on the stage. Alistair gave a brief, powerful speech about the importance of questioning authority and listening to one's intuition. Then it was Eleanor's turn. With Clara standing discreetly behind her wheelchair, Eleanor spoke into the microphone, her voice weaker than it once was, but resonant with unshakable strength. "A year ago," she began, "I was told my life was over. I was a prisoner in my own body, silenced by a man I trusted. But one person refused to believe the silence. One person listened, not to the doctors or the machines, but to the beating of a human heart." She turned her head and smiled at Clara, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude. "Clara Bell saved my life. She did not do it with medicine or money. She did it with attention, with courage, and with a stubborn, beautiful hope. She taught my son, and all of us, what it means to truly care for someone." The ballroom erupted in applause. Alistair moved to stand behind his mother's chair, placing a hand on her shoulder. His eyes met Clara's over his mother's head, and in his gaze she saw everything, his love, his gratitude, his promise of a shared future. They were no longer a billionaire, a maid, and a patient. They were a family, forged, found, and healed. The journey had been a descent into a nightmare, but it had brought them here, into the light, together. True wealth, they learned, wasn't measured in stock prices or sprawling estates, but in the quiet courage to listen to a silent heart and the love that blossoms in the soil of shared healing. Before we go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that.